here at The Ohio State University. It is my great honor to welcome you to the Ohio State University for the inaugural conference of the Dance Studies Association. From the mighty forces of the Congress on Research in Dance and Society of Dance History Scholars. I always tell my students that the field is made up of people, that individuals produce the research we hold so dear. It is so exciting to have the field in this room and to welcome you to campus. This conference came together by the tireless work of many individuals over the past 3 years and the support of units across campus. I would like to take a moment to thank the Ohio State College of Arts and Sciences, Arts and Humanities Office of Research, ASC Technology Services, the Advanced Computing Center for the Arts and Design, the Arts Initiative, the Asian American Studies Program, the Barnett Center for Integrated Arts and Enterprise, the Center for Slavic and East European Studies, Dancers in Graduate School, the Melton Center for Jewish Studies, the Korean Performance Research Program, the Departments of African and African American Studies, Comparative Studies, History of Art, Theater, Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies, the School of Music Musicology Program, the University of Dayton Department of Music and Theater, Dance, and Performance Technology Program, and the New England Foundation for the Arts National Dance Project. And my colleagues and students who have volunteered and supported this event in myriad ways, and members of the program committee, local arrangement committee, and volunteers, and they are all listed in your program. Interdisciplinary elements. So I just have a handful of logistics before we move on. Anyone in a purple Dance Studies Association t-shirt can help you. We have an amazing corps of student and faculty volunteers. Catherine Holt is heading them up. She and Janet Schrader, who are waving at you right now, doctoral students in our program, can help you with any questions you might have. They can direct you to the right place. Just a quick note on how tonight will go. We've got these remarks, and then we have our opening plenary. Then we have a dance party spun by citizen Dorian S., the House of Ono Tough Love crew. Food and drinks are available all night long, so please stay, party, enjoy the plenary, enjoy each other, and dance until 10:30. In time for the 7:30 working groups tomorrow morning. The chairs will be cleared, right after the plenary. The last shuttle bus to the Hilton is at 11. your first time attending a dance studies conference and you would like to meet others, head to the Heirloom Cafe in the Wexner Center for the Arts for dinner tomorrow. The cafe will be open for the Friday night Parallel Connections performance. We encourage you to informally find each other there. Newcomers also have the option of putting a blue dot on your name tag to self-identify. You can get those at registration. This is our largest conference yet. So, introduce yourself to people you don't know as we continue to grow the dance studies community. Just a couple more details and then we will get going. We do have a conference photographer. If you see her jockeying for a shot, please strike a pose. She's documenting the event. We're thrilled to have her here. For those of you who participate in social media, we have designated DSA 2017 as the official conference hashtag. It's written on the balloons outside, so if you need a reminder, it's out there for you. Many of you volunteered to chair a session, so thank you for that. Some of the confirmation emails got lost in the wires. So tonight, please check the program for your name. If you have a newfound conflict, let the registration desk know and leave them your cell number, and they'll relay it to me and we'll figure it out. Lastly, we would like to acknowledge that some of our members have been impacted by hurricanes, fires, earthquakes, inability to obtain visas into the US, and other hardships, and they are unable to join us. We send our love and compassion to those who embark on the process of rebuilding. For those of you who are here, we are so excited that you have traveled from near and far to join us for this momentous inaugural conference of the Dance Studies Association. We wish you a joyful and illuminating conference. My department chair, Susan Hadley, was hoping to speak this evening, but she's had to go over to Morrison for the dress rehearsal for tomorrow night, so she also extends her warm regards. So pleased that you will be here with us this weekend. And now I turn it over to Ann Cooper-Albright and Ann.
We would like to identify the CORD and SDHS board members who worked for the last couple of years on this merger. So
Tirelessly.
If you're in the room, which I hope you are, please stand when we read your name.
Ariel Osterweiss. Okay, just hold your applause. There are a lot of people, all right? We'll applaud afterwards.
Anusha Kadar.
Alexandra Cole.
Rosemary Roberts.
Arlene Yu.
Hannah Kostrin.
Grisha Coleman.
Kinyan Seto.
Hannah Jodrin.
Ketu Ketrak.
Jasmine Johnson.
Danielle Goldman.
Katrina F.K.
Bridget Cothery.
Michael Bodell.
Jennifer Fisher.
Nina Benham.
Sharon Ray.
Raquel Monroe.
Stacy Prickett.
Rebecca Rosen.
Nadine Graves George.
Rebecca Cowell.
Takia Amin.
Rosemary Candelario. Susanna McGrath. Victoria Fortuna.
Ray Miller.
And Susan Manning. Yay!
Yes, I've got my list. It's exactly 2 years ago this weekend that the boards of CORD and SDHS met at the new school and began working in earnest on the merger and with consultant Nancy Erickson. So I think it's really interesting that this is exactly the weekend 2 years ago that we started this work, to give you a sense of the what it's like to merge one organization that's 50 years old and another organization that's close to 40 years old. And on July 12th, 2017, we received the official papers from the Attorney General Office of the State of New York, with a name change incorporating Dance Studies Association as the new association. And so there's a legacy there of the incorporation papers are dated in 1969. And so even though the organization is, quote, new, it's grounded in 50 years of dance scholarship. So we're really delighted about that. We just had the first meetings of the existing Dance Studies Association board. There are 11 people on the board right now. We had 2 days of really productive meetings. Tomorrow at the award luncheon, we'll have a segment of a membership meeting. So I'll save any little reporting items, for that meeting tomorrow. And also on Saturday, there's going to be a town hall meeting. So this is just an open meeting for members to come and just ask questions about the Dance Studies Association. As you can imagine, the people that have been working on it for 2 years are quite immersed in the details, but we recognize that for everyone else, there's just a lot of new information. So it's really an open session for people to come and find out about what's going on with Dance Studies Association. And just one final piece of housekeeping. The membership luncheon tomorrow is experiencing an over-success registration problem, where the room cannot actually fit all of the people that have come to the conference, so we consider this a good problem. And the resolution has been to have a secondary room that will have live caption of what's going on in the main room. So the board, many of the board members will be sitting in that room. We'd be happy for you to just self-identify. I think we need about 50, 60, 70 people to 40 people, yes, to sit in that room. So I just wanted to make that announcement. And finally, to just say thank you to Susan Hadley and the Department of Dance at The Ohio State University for their incredible generosity. Will be on the receiving end of that level of thoughtfulness and consideration, and truly a standing ovation for Hannah Kostra. Oh, yeah!
Partake. All right, so we're just going to pause a moment before the plenary. This wraps up our welcoming remarks, so welcome again. We'll take a pause as the plenary speakers get set up. If you want to get another drink, the bar remains open all night. There is still food, and then we will reconvene in just a few minutes. After the plenary, the chairs will be magically cleared, and then the dance party will begin. So looking forward to spending the rest of the evening and the weekend with you. Thanks.
So I know that she would be thrilled that this session is in her honor, and I thank the association so much for making that happen. I'm thrilled that you are here to participate, and if you are interested in seeing the collection or any of the other collections in the library, we'd be thrilled to have you come. I'll turn it over to Sam and we'll get started.
Thank you. I'm Dorf. I teach music at the University of Dayton, and I'm very excited to welcome this wonderful plenary panel. We have four great scholars who are all musicians and all dance scholars. And as a musicologist and dance historian, I love that the first panel for the DSA will be about music and dance. I also recognize that talking about music and dance is the only thing separating us from listening to music and dance. So I will end my remarks here and welcome our first speaker, Joe Schloss. Joe Schloss is an interdisciplinary scholar. Oh, yes. Yeah. I will read a very long, no, just kidding. Joe Schloss is an interdisciplinary scholar who studies the way people use music and dance to develop new perspectives on social, cultural, and political issues. He's primarily interested in hip-hop culture as part of a larger complex of expressive traditions of the African diaspora. He's the author of Foundations, B-Boys, G-Girls, and Hip-Hop Culture in New York, published by Oxford University Press, and Making Beats, the Art of Sample-Based Hip-Hop, Wesleyan University Press, which won the International Association for the Study of Popular Music Book Prize in 2005. He's also the co-author of Rock, Music, Culture, and Business, Oxford University Press, with Chris Waterman and Larry Starr. His writing has appeared in the anthologies Total Chaos and Classic Material, and magazines include URB, Vibe, the Seattle Weekly, and The Flavor. He currently teaches at Princeton University and the City University of New York. Let's welcome Chris.
Thank you. I just wanted to start by thanking everybody involved in the arrangements, particularly Hannah Kloster and Sam for putting this panel together. I'm extremely honored to be on this panel with my colleagues here, and also slightly terrified to be going first, so I will do my best. In thinking about what would be useful to talk about today, I came up with two ideas. The first is ways in which my own work makes use of a choreomusicological approach in the sense of understanding music and dance to be components of a single larger organic process, both in any given moment, but also in terms of historical development over time. The second is a bit more meta, which is how that approach fits into the larger project of hip-hop studies overall, or how it doesn't, and what some of the implications of that relationship might be for the role of dance in other fields. And before I start, I just wanted to quickly note, for the purposes of this paper, I use the term breaking to refer to a specific form of hip-hop dance that's also known as b-boying, b-girling, or breakdancing. The reasons are way too complicated to go into here, but mostly have to do with ideas of gender and authenticity and their relationship to each other. I'm happy to talk about that later if anybody wants. So I'm not a dancer, I'm an ethnomusicologist by training. I became interested in hip-hop dance through my research on hip-hop music, which led me back to a repertoire of songs that early hip-hop DJs and dancers both liked. These are recordings that were made between about 1969 and 1974, which often fused Latin and African-American musical influences, and which featured a break, which, as probably most of you know, is a moment in a song when melodic elements are temporarily suspended, that's hard to say, temporarily suspended, leaving only the percussion groove. What initially intrigued me was not only that the hip-hop community recognized these songs as being historically significant, but also that they felt so strongly about it that b-boys and b-girls were still dancing to those exact same songs some 30 years later. And that was 10 years ago, so now 40 years later. And the more I listened to these records, the more I wanted to be able to dance to them too. And so I started to learn. And that was basically my introduction to hip-hop dance. So I tell you that for three reasons. The first is to emphasize that for me personally, the relationship between music and dance was the gateway to my appreciation of dance, and has always been at the heart of it. In other words, I wasn't someone who saw people breaking and was attracted to the movements for their own sake, which I think is how most people become interested in that dance form. I was specifically attracted to the movements as a response to the music, and that this was an embodied process, one that I personally felt viscerally, and I understood it as such at the time. The second is that I came to dance from the broader hip-hop culture rather than vice versa, and the implications of that path are a big part of what I want to talk about tonight. And finally, I want to note that that experience gave me a personal appreciation of the fact that, as with many forms in many cultures, hip-hop music and dance evolved symbiotically, so you really can't understand one without the other, which is why I decided to study that relationship. Hey, Gary. But in preparing for this talk, it occurred to me that the more interesting and hopefully more useful question for this panel is not why I decided to study that relationship in depth, but really why so many others didn't. Because I think the answer to that question has less to do with individual choices and more to do with academic politics, power, and ideology. In other words, as someone who crossed the threshold from music into dance, so to speak, I don't think it was that other hip-hop researchers walked up to that door and then declined to go through it. I think it just never occurred to them that that door was there in the first place. And so I want to think about why that might have been the case. But first I want to talk briefly about the actual relationship between music and dance and hip-hop, and specifically why the dance is essential for understanding the origins of the musical practice. In the early 70s, DJs were playing records for teens in the South Bronx, as you know. Now the thing about recorded music as opposed to live music is that theoretically, a record sounds the same no matter who plays it. So your only competitive advantage as a DJ lies in either having records that other DJs don't have, or playing them in a different way from other DJs somehow. And the success of either of these strategies would be judged by whether or not people dance to it. At the same time that this was happening, a new dance called rocking was developing among second-generation New York Latinos, and essentially they adapted Latin dance moves and aesthetics to rock, soul, and funk music. This was a battle dance in which the climactic moments were marked by a specific genre of moves called the drop or the jerk that involved briefly dropping to the floor on the break. And I want to just quickly show you some footage that I took about a year ago, just to give you a sense of what that entails. How do I check here? So all you really need to know about this is that the people on the left side of the screen are battling the people on the right side of the screen. It's only like 20 seconds long. So I just wanted to show you that, that's all. I just wanted to give you a sense of the energy that was happening in those environments. DJ Kool Herc saw the way rockers were reacting to the breaks when we played them, and so we used the turntables to mechanically extend the break's duration, and in response, rockers increasingly emphasized what they called down rock, the moments when they were closer to the floor. In response to that, Herc and other DJs began to extend the break more and more, and dancers stayed down longer and longer. Since the manipulation of records in this way was a far more labor-intensive process than just playing them, the DJs had less and less time to announce records and hype the crowd up, so they found a friend to do that. These friends, who were the first hip-hop MCs, started to use rhymes as part of their presentation. These rhymes made the breaks interesting even for people who weren't rockers and didn't actually want to dance to them. That interest, in turn, allowed the DJ to play more breaks without losing the crowd, which made the dancers have to invent new down-rocking moves, which made the DJ have to play more breaks, which made the MC have to write more rhymes, and the cycle continued. When the first rap recordings were made in 1979, they featured MCs rhyming over breakbeats, often reproduced by live bands. My point here is that conceptually, that approach makes absolutely no sense at all if you try to see it as a purely musical development. In other words, you wouldn't just go from playing live funk music to talking over a band playing short sections of commercially produced funk records over and over again. It only makes sense if you see it as an attempt to imitate the sound of a live event that had dance at its core. I learned this history, along with several variations, from people in the hip-hop dance community. And the reason I was able to do that is because it's been carefully passed down through a complex apprenticeship system for the last 40 years. So I was not only learning the history itself, I was learning a culture-specific methodology and ideology for understanding and transmitting that history, and you can see how that ties into the themes of this conference. These intellectual approaches are themselves part of a larger body of intellectual, aesthetic, and practical knowledge that's passed down from teacher to student under the general rubric of foundation, which is why I call my book Foundation. Foundation includes actual dance moves, battle strategy, aesthetic theory, history, and other tools for dancers' development. To state the obvious, this is a big deal. And it runs directly counter to stereotypes of this dance as just being a bunch of kids spinning on their heads. And given that this highly complex and traditional body of knowledge is central to the practice of hip-hop dance, it stands to reason that the study of dance should therefore have a lot to offer hip-hop scholars in general. So why does hip-hop scholarship in general seem to have rejected that offer? And just to be a little bit more specific, I did an extremely unscientific and informal survey of kind of anthologies in different places where collections of hip-hop scholarship amass, I don't know what it would be. And generally I found that in terms of general hip-hop studies scholarship, somewhere between 2 to 5% of it tends to focus on dance. But so why is that? I think there are basically 3 possible reasons for the absence of dance for most hip-hop studies discourse. The first would be that for some reason researchers weren't able to see breaking for the important cultural form that it is. The second is that researchers were able to see it for what it was, but for some reason they didn't think it was feasible to write about it, either in general or in the context of their particular discipline. And the third, which I think is particularly relevant here, is that people did write about it, but their work was so marginalized that mainstream hip-hop scholars like me don't know about it. My point is this: all of those possibilities involve the leveraging of real power in academic institutions: ideological power, economic power, social power, and cultural power. So first, they weren't able to see breaking for the important cultural form that it was. You're going to give me like a 3-minute warning. Hip-hop dance in particular complicates many of the binaries that often serve to frame conversations about hip-hop culture. For example, hip-hop studies discourse often makes an implicit distinction between commercial and authentic culture. But many of the people who are most recognized for preserving the traditional culture of hip-hop dance, such as the Rocksteady crew, were also the ones who have done the most to popularize the form commercially. In the context of hip-hop dance, commercial and authentic are not necessarily opposites. Another thread of hip-hop studies is a conscious or unconscious attempt to legitimize the study of hip-hop to a skeptical academic audience that buys into traditional European mind-body distinctions. So they often privilege the more self-consciously intellectual expressions of the culture over those that are viewed as being more physical and therefore presumably less intellectual. But in the context of hip-hop dance, mind and body are not opposites. Another binary that frames much of the hip-hop discourse is a dichotomy between identifying hip-hop as a specifically African-American art form versus viewing it through a more multicultural lens. Hip-hop dance grew from a diverse array of ethnic influences drawn from many parts of the African diaspora, including but not limited to African-American and Afro-Latino cultures. The dance's origins, in other words, were multiculturally Black. Moreover, based on these origins, the dance's originators created a competitive art form that prided itself on being a meritocracy that judged dancers on their ability to embody fundamentally African aesthetic principles, regardless of their own ethnicity. In the context of hip-hop dance, Black and multicultural are not opposites. This type of influence also manifests itself on a more general level. I think the lines between departments and schools reflect one culture-specific way of categorizing knowledge, and each of those categories has its own distinctive body of theory and methodology designed to address it, all the normal Foucault stuff. But this means that when hip-hop was categorized by the system, it was assigned a body of theory and methodology which may not necessarily be well suited to study dance. That in turn may make dance seem like a less attractive subject for study, and may also make disciplines that do study dance seem farther away from other disciplines for interdisciplinary purposes than they actually are. In other words, the reality of hip-hop dance just doesn't fit well into the intellectual framework of hip-hop studies. Finally, I think it's important not to minimize the fact that hip-hop studies itself is living in an academic, social, and political world that is just saturated with racism in general. So if the academic resources available for the study of Afro-diasporic culture overall were themselves severely restricted, it's understandable that those in charge of distributing those resources may have directed them to subjects that were viewed as more pressing than breakdancing. And when I say resources, I don't mean just money, I also mean more abstract things like attention and status. The second possibility is that people were the academic conversations that were already happening around hip hop, so the researcher might have preemptively abandoned it because it just seemed like a dead end, either conceptually or professionally. So that ties into labor issues in the academy as well. And again, I don't think that this disconnect is malicious or even intentional in most cases. It's basically self-censorship. But in my opinion, that actually makes it even more insidious. Finally, dance may be made invisible through social geography. Some aspects of hip-hop culture can be studied at a distance, particularly those that were meant to be experienced through the mass media in the first place. But generally speaking, dance is not such an aspect. It could only be experienced in specific social spaces. And to the degree that that's the case, any given researcher's access to that art form, is going to be mediated by their knowledge of and access to those spaces. I think this primarily operates in terms of race and gender, but there are other areas in which that works as well. As a practical matter, navigating the researcher's personal relationship to the social space in which hip-hop takes place is just not part of the methodology of many of the disciplines that have been used to study hip-hop culture. So it would make it difficult to study dance using those methodologies if you're not already part of the hip-hop dance community. And going back to my previous point, if you think those methodologies are the only ones available to study hip-hop, then you're just going to have a hard time studying dance. And the third possibility, which is, like I said, probably the most relevant to this gathering, is that people did write about it, but because of the disconnects I just mentioned, their work never became a force in the hip-hop studies world at large. I think this is pretty much self-explanatory. I think there are two general categories of people who are affected by this. Researchers who have worked in fields that were not traditionally associated with the hip-hop studies mainstream, folklore, performance studies, dance, and researchers who are working outside of the academy. And I'm not going to list people in the former category because honestly, I'm terrified of leaving somebody out, which I'm sure I will do, and I know there are people in this room that fall into that category, so I honor all of you collectively, and we can talk individually about this later. But the second category I think is also important to emphasize. Hip-hop dance practitioners have produced many works of scholarship that are just not on the radar of hip-hop studies scholars at all, including books like Alienness is the Art of Battle, Louis Estrada's The Dancing Gangsters of the South Bronx, Louis De Jesus' The Kings of Dance, Mr. Wiggles' website, Wigsy.biz, Podmaster Fable's documentary Apache Line From Dance to Hip-Hop, and a variety of YouTube and DVD documentaries. This work often has a different agenda from academic study, but that's precisely why it's valuable, because it can alert us to approaches and concepts that may not have occurred to us in the academy. So, why does hip-hop studies tend to ignore dance? Simply put, dance usually doesn't answer the questions that hip-hop studies wants to ask. But that's not the dance's fault, that's the question's fault. Hip-hop dance isn't marginal. It only seems marginal because the discourse is not equipped to handle it. But what I've tried to suggest here is that that's not the result of individual scholars' choices so much as it is of the larger social, cultural, and institutional pressures that operate in the academy. So redefining hip-hop studies in such a way as to include dance is not only valuable because it would include dance, which is not nothing, but more so because it would require us to address those pressures. It would require us to break down the conceptual, methodological, and disciplinary barriers that have tended to exclude dance in the first place. And those barriers have almost certainly excluded a lot of other important things too. So bringing dance into the fold would necessarily require us to reflect on a lot of problematic assumptions about theory, methodology, gender, sexuality, race, and institutional power. And I just have two final thoughts I want to conclude with. First, I'm talking about this in the context of hip-hop studies because that's what I know about, but I'm quite sure that these issues are not unique to hip-hop. And so I felt like as somebody coming from a musical perspective, speaking to dance scholars, that's at least for comparative purposes might be something that's useful to you. And then secondly, I also want to be clear that a lot of the work I'm advocating is already being done. And I want to particularly cite the work of Naomi Reagan, Imani K. Johnson, and Mary Fogarty in that regard. A lot of this work hasn't been published yet, but it will be in the next few years. And I think the extent to which dance research is embraced by the larger hip-hop studies world will really define the future of hip-hop studies itself, or at least in my opinion, it should. So thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Our next speaker is Tomie Hahn. She is an artist, an ethnomusicologist, Her book, Sensational Knowledge, Embodying Culture Through Japanese Dance, focuses on the transmission of embodied cultural knowledge, and it was awarded the Alan P. Merriman Prize. She's also director of the Center for Deep Learning at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute and professor in the Arts Department. Let's welcome Tomie.
Can you hear me if I stand here? Behind the bush? I'm only 5 foot tall, so if I stand behind the podium, you will see a little bit of a head popping up. And the expressive body, even with the bush, never mind. One correction in my bio is that I'm the director of the Center for Deep Listening. This is a center continuing the work of Pauline Oliveros, who passed away last November on Thanksgiving Day. Is it okay for you that I'm over here? My talk is entitled Sensible Matters, Transmission, Time, and Anticipation. Staring at my hand, I wonder how it knows how to dance with a fan. After years of practice, surely clues hide within bone, nerve, sinew. Later, as the wind sweeps away my ball path, my hand darts out to snatch it, and I consider the hand anticipating in the moment. I've been considering the body in the field, sensually immersed in a variety of cultural settings. I view the body as a field site, existing and changing over time. The senses reside in a unique position as the link between the body and the external world. They are curious transmission devices through which we take in information, comprehend the experience, assign meaning, and often react to the stimuli. Senses enable us to construct parameters of existence, what defines the body, self, social group, or world. I've been thinking about transmission for a very long time, and it would be pieces. Lessons over a longer period of time come next. Cycles of events over years, and even longer time scales that involve lineages of performers transmitting their art over generations. As long as multi-scale context remains stable over multiple time scales, we can come to experience ourselves living inside time on multiple levels. Telescoping and unfolding of time experienced within the body. Anticipation offers us a view of these varied time scales as cultural contexts. Through transmission of time-based arts, we learn to smoothly shift between these scales of time or embody them simultaneously. Embodied anticipations mirror cultural sensibilities of time. Can we be aware of sensing time on multiple scales? Is this not a heightened awareness of moving, changing body that knows itself and can anticipate within time? So allow me to tell you a few stories of transmission involving the expressive, anticipating body. I'm going to juxtapose when you get in the truck, as soon as you're in there, you just kind of, I don't know, I kind of zone out in my own little world and I'm at one with the truck, you know? There's not a part of that truck that I'm not aware of at any given moment when I'm in it. I mean, you become one with it, you know? When you're flying up in the air, you know, roar! He did that. You get up in the air and it's like, you know there's times when you're up there and it's like, okay, I know I just jumped, but when am I gonna land? Am I gonna land? End quote. Here, the anticipation of movement in time and space suspends. Sensory information orients the moment to the space, to the larger time scales. Meanwhile, the body knows. Neural pathways reinforced over years of practice and embodied consciousness as anticipation, as embodying time.
Is Assistant Professor of Musicology at Arizona State University's Herberger Institute School of Music and Managing Editor of the Journal of Jazz Studies. He received his PhD in 2014 from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. His dissertation on drummer band leader Chip Webb and swing music and social dance in Harlem during the Great Depression. Received the Society for American Music's Wiley Housewright Dissertation Award and UNC's Glenn Hyden Award for an outstanding dissertation in musicology. A social jazz dancer for over a decade, Dr. Wells is currently writing a book about the history of jazz music's ever-shifting relationship with social and popular dance.
Frankie Manic, then 88 years old, came to Greensboro, North Carolina to teach a weekend workshop that would change the trajectory set me on a path toward the career I have now. Manning, an elite social dancer at Harlem's Savoy Ballroom and member of the professional dance troupe Whitey's Lindy Hoppers in the 1930s and 40s, began traveling around the world again in the 1980s following his retirement from a 30-year career as a postal worker, where he taught the Lindy Hop and fueled a revival of global interest in the dance that persists to this day. Frankie Manic was an intensely and sensitively musical dancer, and an important participant in the often discussed give and take between jazz musicians and social dancers during the 1930s, as improvising dancers traded rhythms with improvising musicians. Now, I'm in the slightly unusual position of being a musicologist whose principal applied aesthetic skills are as a social dancer rather than as a musical performer. And and at the core of my research is the question of jazz dancers' musicality in this way. Investigating as a music historian what this sort of musicality means and how it's expressed presents significant methodological challenges. How does one begin to explore rhythmic interactions between musicians and dancers expressed in live music, that were expressed through live music that went unrecorded and live social dancing that went unfilmed? So here I'll offer two excerpts from different research projects of mine that offer traces or resonances of Manic's multi-layered musicality as we can find them in oral histories, in musical recordings, and in film dance routines that my own experience as a Lindy Hop dancer has helped me to identify and interpret. Now, I want to acknowledge the late Terry Monahan, who is a scholar of Lindy Hop dancing, a scholar of the Savoy Ballroom, specifically for the way he conceptualized parsing Lindy Hop dancing into social competition and performance as three separate but highly interrelated forms of the dance that in different contexts have their own characteristics but continue to loop back and inform each other. So largely what I'm going to be talking about here are examples from competition and performance Lindy Hop that help me find traces of this harder to identify social space from the 1930s. Part 1, saying gotcha, dialogue, gamesmanship, and mirror. I've long been interested in drummer Chick Webb, house band leader at the Savoy Ballroom during much of the 1930s, because of his reputation for being particularly sensitive to and in tune with the dancers on the floor. In particular, Webb and his musicians had a rapport with the Savoy's elite dancers, as the members of Whitey's Lindy Hoppers would practice in the ballroom during the day as the band rehearsed, and Webb would reportedly solicit their feedback. On the social dance floor, and during regular competitions at the Savoy, this sensitivity led to a gamesmanship between musicians and dancers who tried to catch each other through micro-musical, rhythmic, and melodic exchanges. As Frank Manic described this dynamic, Chick Webb would play for us. He played for the dancers, and we had this wonderful communication between the dancer and the band. And, you know, like Chick, we would get out on the floor and we'd be dancing, and you know, Chick Webb would focus on, oh, he'd see somebody out there dancing and they'd be doing this step, and he would catch it. By closely watching and catching dancers' movements, Webb inspired them to greater virtuosity through an escalating game of call and response. Manning explained to me during a 2008 interview that close one-on-one connections between musicians and dancers occurred primarily during musical solos. When he's playing the arrangement, you've got to follow the line, but when one of the musicians would take a solo and you were dancing, that's when he would improvise. I'm not saying all musicians did that, but Taft Jordan, Webb's trumpet player, was pretty good at it. He watched the dancers and he tried to catch what they'd do. It's like an inspiration to the dancer, and it's also an inspiration to the music. Sometimes maybe he can come up with a little riff or a little cut in the music that he can use. Such mutual inspiration through live interaction with dancers suggests that musicians' solos were anything but, as they created a space to communicate with dancers that became a fundamental part of the ballroom's sociality. This kind of symbiotic conversation encapsulates the relationship between musicians and elite Lindy Hop dancers, who fed from each other's virtuosity and created a common kinesthetic language that yielded visual expression from dancers and oral expression from musicians. The sonic traces of such collaboration likely continue to exist on record and in many of the common riffs and licks that comprise jazz musicians' vocabularies, just as kinetic traces are no doubt still present in a range of American popular dances. While claiming concordances between these traces is nearly always a conjectural exercise, I have managed to find one. A rhythm Manic scattered to me during our 2008 interview that also appears on a radio transcription of a live web performance of the Count Basie tune, 1 O'Clock Jump. 4 straight unsyncopated beats, stated and then repeated at twice the speed. Webb plays this figure in the closing 2 bars of a wing trio as an accent, preparing the tune's closing series of vibrant shout choruses. According to Manning, this was the rhythm of a step he struggled to perfect, and then Webb caught when he finally nailed it during one of the Savoy's regular Saturday night contests. I hope the levels are right and you can hear this in Manning's own voice, but if not, I've got everything transcribed on the screen for you. Choreomusicology and choreographic labor. And I want to acknowledge that this part of the talk comes from a co-authored piece of research, and my collaborator is Dr. Rachel Short, who is a musicologist at Shenandoah Conservatory, also a longtime Lindy Hop dancer. It's been a real pleasure working with her on this, and I wanted to acknowledge her efforts in crafting this part of the presentation as well. As a subculture, Lindy Hop dancers are studiously obsessed with old film clips, and one in particular is widely considered our holy grail. The Whitey's Lindy Hoppers routine from the 1941 Wilson and Johnson comedy film Hellzapoppin. How many folks have seen this? Does anyone show up in classes? Then you're definitely going to want to pay attention to this. When I started dancing 14 years ago, it was among the first film clips I downloaded and watched, and I was entranced by the speed, energy, and athleticism I saw from the dancers. Hellzapoppin, released by Universal in 1941, was a vehicle for the screwball comedy duo of Wilson and Johnson, adapted from their Broadway show of the same name. The film is effectively a slapstick meta-comedy that follows the duo through the production and realization of their absurdist screenplay. At one point, a group of African-American laborers, chefs, maids, waiters, and the like, find themselves on an empty soundstage, and they're led by the musical comedy duo Slim and Slam, who I think are supposed to be janitors, to begin an impromptu small combo jam session. At one point, the session is interrupted by a drummer. It's pictured up there. Slim Gallard exclaims to the drummer, "Hey Pops, keep that beat a-beatin'. I feel a rhythmic brainstorm coming on. This thing might turn into something. If I ain't mistaken, here comes something now." The scene then cuts to an ensemble of 8 Lindy Hop dancers dressed in similar vocational garb, who perform what has come to be the film's most famous scene, a routine that Manning conceived and choreographed. Throughout the 1930s, as a member of Whitey's Lindy Hoppers, Manning was responsible for a number of choreographic innovations within the Lindy Hop as a performance medium. In addition to pioneering aerial maneuvers or air steps with which Lindy Hop dancing is commonly associated, Manning also moved Lindy Hop performances towards more organized synchronous choreography, integrating the traditional focus on couples into larger ensemble structures. And so below, I'll just hit play on without sound. This is the ensemble section of the Hellzapoppin choreography. For Hellzapoppin, Manning planned the group's routine to Count Basie's 1938 recording of Jumpin' at the Woodside. Manning began his process by listening to the recording repeatedly and envisioning the steps he would pair that would pair well with different parts of the song. However, Basie's recording does not appear in the film. As was common practice at the time, Universal commissioned in-house arranger Freddie Martin to write a new arrangement to accompany the routine. By Manning's account, Martin sat in on rehearsals and was tasked with creating an original composition for the film in order to avoid paying for the rights to Basie's recording. The new piece was completed within a week, and the group rehearsed to the new work from then on, which likely explains the significantly faster tempo, 313 beats per minute, at which the routine appears in the film, and that is an exhausting pace for anyone to try to Lindy Hop. It's just, oof. So here's an excerpt featuring Manning himself and his partner Ann Johnson performing the routine's fourth chorus. I'm going to adjust the levels as I thought I might need to. Ears are important. Let's try that again. In his 2007 autobiography, co-authored with dancer Cynthia Millman, Manning describes his choreographic process, both for Hellzapoppin and in general, in substantial depth. He makes clear that for him, choreography is an intensely musical process. And that underlines mine. When I'm choreographing, the first thing I think about is the music. It's my inspiration. Usually I work from a recording. On rare occasions, I might make up a step to a swing tune that I'm humming. My goal is for the audience to see the dancers and musicians working in sync. The majority of what I do is accent certain beats, phrases, or sounds with a movement. Like I might kick my leg out just as the drummer hits a downbeat. I'm pretty good at phrasing steps into musical rhythms, and I'm partial to movements that go smoothly into the next one or end with a break. Most of all, I want to emphasize the riffs the band is playing. When set to the Basie recording, the musicality of Manning's choreographic process is far more apparent. He and Johnson here do less to match Lester Young's tenor solo than to emphasize the ensemble riff supporting it. They do this in 2 instances. First with a snatch aerial, a spin, and a through the legs, and a second time with an over-the-back aerial, a somersault, and a swift kick in the butt. This solo also emphasizes Manning's perspective on the flashy aerial steps as fundamentally and necessarily musical, where timing matters as much as or more than technical execution. Manning was particular throughout his life to call these moves air steps to emphasize this. As he explained, quote, "In the Lindy Hop, you throw the girl in time with the music and she's got to land right on the beat and start dancing again." Now, Manning himself offered praise for Freddie Martin's arrangement, offering that he was, quote, right on the money. Manning, however, says only that Martin, quote, really wanted to come up with something that was as lively as Jumpin' at the Woodside. And while Martin succeeded in this specific task, his arrangement revises Maning's choreography in what I'm arguing are problematic ways. Beyond the obvious removal of most of the specific musical phenomena that Maning's choreography reflects, which obfuscates Maning's nuances of phrasing and timing, the Martin arrangement amplifies the physical intensity and apparent wildness in the dancing. Martin's music is animated and bouncy. The uniform and homogeneous sections build in sonic intensity, and there is less variety between the timbre of different instruments for each new chorus in Martin's orchestration, flattening the instrumental complexity that's present in the bassy choruses to which Manning conceived the piece. This conceals the subtle musicality as choreographed to the now silent bassy recording, in which Manning crafted each dance pair's routine to enter with some new element of orchestration. The arrangement, in effect, re-renders the movement on screen, sonically emphasizing racialized tropes of frenetically energized black dancing bodies, while obscuring black cleverness, aural sensitivity, and choreographic labor in the process. This aural erasure of choreographic labor mirrors the film's actual production circumstances, as Manning never received choreographic credit for his work in this routine on the film. Furthermore, from the moment Slim, Slam, and their professional jazz musician colleagues happen upon some instruments to jam on, until Whitey's Lindy Hoppers are caught fooling around on the job, the high-level artistry of professional black musicians and dancers is presented as natural, spontaneous, and avocational. One could argue that this is true of most or all performances within this film's genre. However, as this one clip has grown beyond its immediate context to represent the epitome of virtuosic Lindy Hop dancing, the reason I asked who shows it in classes is I know that jazz historians show it in their classes as well. It becomes increasingly important to see that dancing as deeply connected to and grounded in a specific musical recording not audible in the film. At a keynote presentation at last year's American Musicological Society annual meeting for the Dance Interest Group, Thomas DeFrance offered the challenge that too often, virtuoso performance dancing on film becomes, in his words, the received archive of all black social dance. Given this challenge of medium, understanding Hellzapoppin and its choreography as virtuosic not only in its speed and athletic difficulty, but also in the thoughtful, sensitive musicality it shares with the social dancing from which it emerges, becomes all the more important. So if you look on YouTube, if you just Google Hellzapoppin and Woodside, you will find that some wonderful YouTubers have sped up the bassy recording so you can show this paired with the music it was originally conceived to, if you choose to. So to review and reflect on the idea of traces and transmissions, in the first case, I've got some scattered syllables from an oral history interview that seem to match one little moment on a radio transcription of an air check. And I have no idea what this step looks like. But we have aural and musical traces via this oral history and commercial recording. In the second case, we have a much more fascinatingly asynchronous example of transmission. We have a commercial musical recording that informed a choreography that informed the composition of a new piece of music that in turn reframes what that choreography signifies. These are two among many traces of Frankie Maning's musicality. And really the big question they raise for me, not just about Manning and specifically just about all of the stuff that I study about musician-dancer interactions, is less about these specific pieces of material, but how they help me envision the size and the scope of what hasn't been transmitted. So insofar as traces, survivals, the stuff that gets preserved somewhere, somehow, the stuff that gets archived as a process institutionally that is on some level always political, always reflects institutional systems of power, always reflects interests, reflects gender, reflects race, reflects which performers particular scholars or folklorists chose to work with, etc. And we all know this. I try to take an approach to this material that, if I'm reflecting back, comes from the approach to dancing Lindy Hop that I was inspired into by Frank Manning, which for me as a social dancer means that looking for traces of choreomusicality is about listening the only way I really know how to, with my whole body, both for traces and for erasures, and being creatively open to all the things they might mean. Thank you.
professor of music and Slavic languages and literatures at Princeton University. He's the author of 4 books, most recently Bolshoi Confidential, which has been spotted under the arm of Sarah Jessica Parker, is that correct? Yeah. And he is actively involved in ballet pantomime performance projects. This past spring, he oversaw a production of Cole Porter's Within the Quota in a new arrangement performed by London's Penguin Cafe and Princeton University dancers. Let's welcome Simon.
First of all, I'm very grateful to Sam Dorf and for inviting me to be part of this discussion, and it's a great pleasure to be here with all you beautiful people. I come from the land of music conferences. Well, they're more fraught. There's a very good vibe here that I appreciate, as Sam will attest. So what I want to do is actually talk about something that puzzled me since this summer, which I spent in Moscow. I went to see the dress rehearsal, and I had a ticket to go and see the ballet Nureyev. But then the ballet was canceled. And then I went to the press conference discussing the cancellation, and I looked at all the extant footage, including some of the things I saw, and I wanted to know what it was about. I wanted to know why it was canceled, and I equally want to know why it's now being performed in December 9th and 10th for the Bolshoi Theater. And what I want to do is actually puzzle over this work and show you a couple of clips from the sort of compendiums from the last rehearsal, the sort of performance of the work that may well be, or wasn't. And I also want to talk conceptually about how music and dance together articulate what might be the very sad and beautiful subject matter of this work. This is about the dancer Rudolf Nureyev. Obviously, the ballet is called Nureyev. And this project was 2 years in the making of Bolshoi. And it's a ballet in name only, because this is a work that has dance and orchestral music, but also involves a lot of spoken word acting in English and French and Russian, operatic and choral singing, film, and photography. There are pictures here of Nureyev in the nude. There's one tiny one there that shows his penis. And there are also photographs of Soviet leaders, but those are not in the nude. The final dress rehearsal of this work looked a little shaky, but that shakiness is the truth of final dress rehearsals everywhere. You can ask Alexei Rogansky about that. And everyone expected the premiere to happen as scheduled. Because the Bolshoi Ballet had just returned from tour, the Corps de Ballet didn't quite have its act together on stage, but they were enough in sync that the creative team, the crew, and the gaggle in attendance at that final run-through were pretty satisfied with it. And the greatest challenge was integrating the multimedia elements, but nothing malfunctioned. Some 600 people put this show together, and it seemed too big to fail. But then it did fail. The Bolshoi Theater premiere was canceled or postponed or prohibited, pending reworking. So I went to the press conference announcing the cancellation. This was a fairly tense gathering in the upper foyer of this gorgeous theater. The general director of the Bolshoi, a pretty straight-laced, competent person named Vladimir Urin, defended canceling the show solely for artistic reasons, budget be damned, and he brusquely rejected any accusation, which was leveled by a couple of reporters, that this work had been canceled under pressure from the Minister of Culture, the homophobic Minister of Culture. And then it moved on, and then there's a lot of discussion and a lot of reviews of the final rehearsal. And then obviously it's been rescheduled for a couple of performances in December. But the person who conceived this show, a director named Kirill Serebrennikov, might not be there because that person has been placed under house arrest. And through October, he's been accused of looting the budget of a non-profit foundation he established as the artistic director of the Gogol Theater Center in Moscow. But we're in the matrix here. And scandals of this sort tend to have, or their perpetrators tend to see in them, a lot of different layers. So the embezzlement charges are thought to be a mirage hiding the actual offense, which is that Mr. Serebrennikov is a provocateur whose theatrical shows have flaunted recent Russian laws prohibiting the propagation of non-traditional lifestyles. Mikhail Baryshnikov came to this arrested director's defense in a warm letter that was posted online on a Russian news site called Poltsa.ru. It basically told Kirill to hang on and said, no matter what these bureaucrats do, and no matter how happy they are sleeping at night after putting you away, your suffering will be rewarded. And in fact, the torments they inflict on you are nothing like the torments that any artist has creating a show or working on a canvas or being behind a camera. So we have this situation in which a dancer who defected during the Cold War, Baryshnikov offering moral support to the director of a ballet about another dancer who defected, Nureyev. Perhaps the director, Serebrennikov, will emerge from house arrest and the show will go on, and the entire fracas will turn out to have been a brilliant PR stunt planned by Serebrennikov in conspiratorial collusion with Urin, but Mr. Baryshnikov doubts this. I'll show you something in a moment. I just want to say that there's a very strident defender of this aborted project. And that person's name is Tatiana Kuznetsova, who is the very smart dance critic for the newspaper Kommersant in Moscow. And she was a former dancer with the Moiseyev Company who toured the United States a lot. She's very liberal. She wrote a book about the Bolshoi Ballet called Chroniki Bolshoi Balleta, which seems to suggest chronicles of the Bolshoi Ballet, but she's very arch, and so that word chroniki has a double meaning. It means also chronic illness. So the chronic illness of the Bolshoi Ballet. She actually reviewed this show. She did not see it live, but she based her remarks on seeing the footage of some 53 minutes, which were filmed from the third ring in the theater of this project. And in an interview for a liberal Russian TV service online called TV Ring, she was somewhat circumspect as to causes for the cancellation of this show. But then she wrote an article for Kommersant, and she said everything about this ballet was exceptional. Everything. She was enraptured, she said, and it was very, she said, what enraptured her the most about it was how subtle and how restrained this very large and expensive production was. So it was exceptionally unexceptional. And she actually concluded that growing social hysteria in Russia about the ballet's gay or bisexual content had scuttled a frankly chaste production. The choreography was by Yuri Kosakov. And Mark Morris tells me that Yuri Kosakov wasn't particularly happy about getting this commission, but he took it on because his previous commissions of Bolshoi for a grand ballet called The Hero of Our Time was a big success. The production includes the most famous of Richard Avedon's photographs of Nureyev in the nude, taken in 1961, the year of his defection from the Soviet Union to the West. And that photograph is flashed onto the back of the stage for a moment. In a scene which shows Nureyev being chased around like paparazzi to very slinky jazz music. There also occurs about halfway through the production a quote-unquote transvestite bacchanalia featuring men in high heels swirling around Nureyev in the red light district of Paris after his defection. This episode seems to refer, I think, tackily to the Ballet of the Nuns of Robert Le Diable. The Men in Heels tableau has also been likened to the witches in Shakespeare's Macbeth as forces of evil, of temptation, of prophecy, of double, toil and trouble. And Mr. Serebrennikov, the arrested director, he's very much double, toil and trouble. He's a provocateur as a director who's aligned himself with a dancer, Nureyev, the real person, who is also a provocateur. Let me show you some footage of the rehearsal. These are two compilations, not my own. absorbed classical technique. So the traditionalism of Yuri Kosokov's reanimation of Nureyev here is unsurprising, as is the emphasis on his androgyny. Nureyev developed the technique of a ballerina, cultivating, in Joe Nakachella's words, a highly pulled up torso and elaborate wafting arm movements to make his legs look longer. He stood on high calf point. Everything about him was stretched, angled, and placed like a ballerina. Today, this look is standard for men in Russia and in the West, but in the Soviet 1950s, it was considered to be effeminate. Kuznetsova goes on to note the accumulation of psychological tension in the arabesque pirouettes that are a dominant feature of this limited syntax, and the heartbeat-like acceleration in Petit Bâtiment in the mirror scene that shows Nureyev and his future lover, Eric Bruin. No kids, she says. And she says, in this scene with Nureyev and Bruin, they touch each other just 5 times, no more than that. There is music here by Ilya Dumutsky. He's described as a natural-born ballet composer. I don't know what that means. But basically, he actually, listening to this score, I really don't know. But he actually put together this score. It's a bric-a-brac, a lot of borrowing from stuff, and he put it together in a way to make it seem that he put it all together. That is to say, it's a very self-conscious pasticcio. One of the words associated with this aesthetic is postmodern. Another is pastiche. Neither parody nor travesty nor organic savoring of generic elements, generic elements. The score for Nureyev is instead strangely nostalgic, referring to the polystylism of later Soviet composers. And the focal point, strangely, is a song or a chorus sung by women, which he patches into the score of crucial coalescing mood. Ultimately, Nureyev's life, the real person, is defined in terms of not fitting in anywhere. But if we're looking for meaning in the morass of this production, it seems to reside within Russia's complicated relationship to its famous artists, especially those who leave. Nureyev's defection is represented as self-willed, not forced upon him. It's part of a conscious decision to shed everything that could get in the way of his own self-absorbed self-realization as an artist. Russia does not forgive its emigres. It punishes them for their elitism. You can claim your identity, another identity. You can borrow the clothes of others, as it were, but you are left naked in the end, staring into the face of the motherland, listening to the strains of a monumental oratorio on a patriotic subject. And now, I want to say what I think this is all about. Kuznetsova said that this is a ballet that represents Nureyev's all-consuming thirst for dance. This was somebody who performed before he died, tragically, sometimes 300 performances a year. And then at the end, she actually says something really startling, which seems to be a provocation of its own. And she takes a swipe at the Minister of Culture of the Russian Federation. She says, you know, it must be admitted here, this final dress rehearsal, that nothing greater or more significant has been produced on either the domestic or the world stage in the 21st century than this work. So let's consider the perverseness of this situation. Nureyev defects to the West, thereafter outing himself for the world to see. He becomes persona non grata in Russia through to the collapse of the USSR. In the 1990s, he is rehabilitated and symbolically returned to Russia. His homosexuality, bisexuality, acknowledged but downplayed. The accent instead placed, as in the case of Tchaikovsky, who's quoted throughout this ballet, as in the case of other famous Russian homosexual artists, he's placed on the pedestal of spiritual transcendence. The director, Sarah Brennikov, received a commission from the Bolshoi to create a ballet about the fecundities of love and dance and music, featuring Nureyev. But then the ballet is pulled from the stage, which in a sense condemns Nureyev again, sending him back into a symbolic exile. Such at least is Sarah Brennikov's tearful assessment of the matter, which holds up as long as this ballet remains unperformed. If it makes it to the stage intact in December, as expected, then I think we've all been duped. Now, perhaps in this moment of uncertainty, will it or will it not be performed? And in the heat of the debate, is it sexy and scandalous or tragic and transcendent lies the real truth not only of Nureyev's career, but also of his Russian, non-Russian context? Certainly this ballet is unabashedly retrospective, even historiographic, and unflinchingly presentist in its design. The ballet begins at the end, or rather after the end of Nureyev's life. He died of AIDS, and his possessions, the decontextualized fragments of his life, were sold at auction. The various lots of that auction preserve different phases of his career, and so the ballet unfolds as a series of flashbacks. Back to his training and education at the Vaganova Academy in Leningrad, through to that romance with Broom, and his final performance in La Bayadère at the Paris Opera, the production that brought his career to a sad and pathetic end. This is a work that traffics in cliches, all of them. All of the ones that define all of the stuff I do for a living nowadays. It's less about Nureyev than the image of Nureyev constructed by the dancer himself, by his handlers, Ballroom journalists, historians. There's the usual neo-primitivist Russianness. Nureyev is the Sith in one of the scenes, a force of nature. His very thorough biographer, Julie Cavanaugh, notes the role of the sycophantic hangers-on in disseminating the cliches about him. But Nureyev's defection, too, has now become a cliche, even though it was the first of a wave of them. So, too, is a cliche was the failure of his romance with Broom, his virtual affairs with Margot Fontaine, and the bathhouse trolling that had brought him inevitably into contact with the HIV virus. And I want to conclude by saying that one of the reasons it was prohibited, some of the discussion said, the choreography and the production was campy. But there isn't much campiness in this work at all. Instead, we see traces of louche cafe society, luxurious Baroque costumes, and carnival masks. We get fragments of Tchaikovsky in the music. Tchaikovsky has, of course, been the cliche of cliches. He's a conjoining of Russia, of thick, melancholic orchestral and theatrical music, of maudlin songs like None But the Lonely Heart, and homosexuality. The composer Tchaikovsky died of cholera, but death being death, it might as well have been from AIDS, given the way Tchaikovsky's life and art have been distorted by huckster biographers into a parable about the dangers of transgression. Never mind the facts. The myth is what matters, and the myth has it that if Tchaikovsky had kept his sexuality hidden, repressed his desire for male-to-male contact, he might have lived longer. Nureyev transgressed. Serebrennikov transgressed, and so did the Bolshoi Theater, who gave the commission to Serebrennikov. Although Nureyev has been rescued from oblivion and rescheduled for performances in December, I wonder if the ultimate simple message of this work will be diluted or excised. I hope not, because cliches aside, the message of this work is very sad, as noted, and very beautiful. And it's here. It's buried in the episode where you see the chorus, which is an episode that frames Nureyev's defection, his so-called leap into freedom. There's a female on-stage chorus which sings a sparklingly stylized version of an old patriotic Soviet anthem. The women wear thick black concert dresses and typical Soviet hairdos. The dancers to the side wear the uniforms of the Komsomol, the Communist Union of Youth. There's a soloist on stage, and she imitates the diction and phrasing of a famous Soviet folk singer named Lyudmila Zykina, whose last name derives from the Russian word for loud. This singer was a friend of Soviet Minister of Culture Yekaterina Frutsova. Nikita Khrushchev and Leonid Brezhnev liked her, as did the founding ruler of North Korea and his son. This singer sang songs about forests and trees and rivers and streams and the soul of the Russian people. She wore expensive jewelry. An asteroid is named after her. Putin feted her just before her death from a stroke at age 80. And there she is, in the middle of a ballet about Nureyev, performing a hymn of pride about the motherland, and she sings these words: "You can't choose your country when your eyes open and you begin to breathe as a baby. Your country accepts you into its bosom as unconditionally as your mother and father do. My country, more tender than a first caress, you taught me to treasure Pushkin's golden tales and Gogol's captivating speech." There are explicit references to the Jewish experience of the Second World War in this text that gets sung on stage. The author of that text, Margarita Alliger, came under fire for those words in 1946 when the poem was published under the noses of the censors in the newspaper Zvezda, Star. She got into trouble back then for pointing out that Jews, like homosexuals, hardly felt safe and secure in Russia. They still don't, and they don't in the United States. Serebrennikov combines the classical and the grotesque, and Pushkin and Gogol in his ballet information reached the cast and crew, Isotok writes, everybody cried. From the director to the dressmakers, the unrealized premiere is now part of history, he writes. The history of modern Russia, which, he says, I do not choose. It's very cynical, that line, especially when coupled with the endless conspiracy theories about everything that dominates Russian and American politics at this moment. The scandal surrounding Nureyev has been incorporated into a familiar ritual, the ritual of being part of a system while also testing its limits. The government allowed Serebrennikov to be radical, giving him just enough cultural power in the form of a theater of his own and prestigious commissions to tempt him or lure him into challenging the government, which is a ritual of another sort. So what happens if he is released from house arrest and the performance proceeds as intended, to stellar reviews with plans laid for productions elsewhere? Will the intelligentsia feel that their protests have been heard, or will that just be another pretext for speculation to the effect that Serebrennikov has been co-opted with the promise not to test the limits again? Does it matter if, after all of the noise, the ballet turns out to be a flop? Or are we not now witnessing the real, true performance, lamenting the loss of a production about loss, a production that auctions off the sounds and sights of Nureyev's brilliant, beguiling existence? Perhaps nothing can top the scandal, the concatenation of opinion and speculation and gossip that became Nureyev's legacy and which now surrounds the ballet about his legacy. I want to end with one paragraph, with the dance critic Tatiana Kuznetsova, whom I mentioned earlier, the defender of this show. She specializes in her writing in a kind of postmodern doublespeak. She made a point that the ballet Nureyev is not about sex, but about love. And indeed the problem is love, rather than sex. Kuznetsova by no means exculpates the production with this remark. Rather, she draws attention to its most subversive element. Russia's anti-gay laws are at war with love. To call gay sex love, according to one horrible comment I read, is to, quote, create a false equivalence between traditional and non-traditional lifestyles. That is what Nureyev is about, the false equivalence. That is what music and dance studies are about, false equivalences. Here you have Gogol and Pushkin, jazz and agitprop, neoclassicism and orientalism, Fontaine and Makarova, Brun and Nureyev, the ballet that wasn't until it was. The subversion lies in the paradoxical juxtaposition of these opposites, these false equivalences, and the scandal of their loving and mutual embrace. Thank you.
So we have time for questions and for all of our panelists, and I turn it to you. We're eager to ask questions. And I will run at you with Frankie.
I'll be brave. The description of Nureyev's, of the dancer portraying Nureyev and his physicality and the way that that way of moving linked up with how ballerinas traditionally dance, being up high on point and all, that wasn't anything like the Baryshnikov that I saw on stage. He was massive, he was sensuous and earthy, and if he did go up high on releve, it just seemed to feed that charismatic power.
You mean when you saw Nureyev on stage? Yeah, that is true. There's a bit of a distortion in the narrative surrounding him because from a Russian-Soviet perspective, he performed, in a more female ballerina style than a masculine one. And then, that style of dancing actually took hold. He's seen as a pioneer, a certain type of, feminization, if you will, of something that was more stocky and cruder and lower to the ground. male bodies in the Russian context. But then over the course of the time, by the time I think you saw him, the footage I've seen of him, he had actually embraced a lot of roles, including the sort of Orientalist look, including the more savage wild beast, the stallion, all of these animal names are appended to him habitually. But at the start, when he got into contact with Aaron Broom, there was a moment that it's described as the Kavanaugh and others as being a moment of a kind of neoclassicism. So you're right in that sense.
I don't know who to thank for this incredible lineup of panelists. If that was you, Sam, thank you very much. Yeah, what a great array for us here. And I guess I wanted to pick up on what you were doing, Joe Schloss, and you were talking, Chris, about Tomie DeFran's coming to the working group and within the musicologists. How do you guys see this dance within the musicological world? I know there are a couple different organizations, the Ethnomusicologists, and the American Musicological Society, the American Musical Society. So do you feel in the last 5 years that all of a sudden there's a kind of openness to this dance research coming together with music? I'm just curious about your assessments of that. I mean, Joe, you made pretty clear your assessment, so I guess maybe I
think I'll give a short answer and then I'll pressure you to give a long answer. One of the things for me about this is that in principle there's always been an openness to that idea, particularly in ethnomusicology, not to force you into agreeing with me, let's say, but I feel like ethnomusicology has always had an openness to that in principle, but it wasn't necessarily always realized in a practical way through resources and through, particularly reaching out to dance scholars. Again, like I was saying, I feel like the actual structure of institutions also works against that in a lot of ways. So, for just speaking to the degree that I can for ethnomusicology, I think it's just a matter of a momentum starting to build more. So I do feel like that's happening more. But I don't feel like there was a particular resistance to it before. I just feel like there were all these other pressures that fit into that.
So I would say there's in music scholarly societies there's pretty much a dance special interest group in each of them. Just as I got contacted about a music interest group here, but the Society for American Music has a dance interest group. The American Musicological Society has one. And Tomie, I believe, is the former chair of the Dance Movement and Gesture Interest Group for the Society for Ethnomusicology. And there have been really interesting waves, I think, of dance scholarship happening within music studies broadly, and these things look very different at the different societies. There's an awful lot of 19th century French ballet scholarship happening at the American Musicological Society meeting versus different kinds of stuff going on. There's probably more social and popular dance at the Ethnomusicology conference than at the other ones, I would say. For me, I think a lot of what this comes down to in terms of where you're welcome to study what and how, I think has to do with what kinds of practitioner skills particular kinds of scholars are expected to have in order to have in order to get certain kinds of jobs in terms of teaching responsibilities, and perhaps also in order to have authority in a particular field. I say that just from my own experience working as a musicologist in jazz studies, where I am not a performer on any jazz instruments. I can't, aside from like a little bit of tap dancing, like make sound in jazz. It's whereas jazz studies in particular is a field where you just see a lot of job postings that are someone with an academic research background and someone to coach an ensemble and someone to teach their instrument. I think a lot of dance jobs are structured in the same way. So I think like that's the other thing is what are the sort of core practitioner skills that you need to have to be eligible for certain kinds of careers. So I think that one of the reasons that I can do the kind of dance work that I do without much of really even a performance dance background and a social dance background is that I've been able to kind of carve this dancing musicologist niche for myself. So I think that's one of the things that come up that maybe we can all just reflect on, or how our institutions structuring job responsibilities and how are those informing the kinds of research in different genres and in different areas that get studied. And maybe that speaks to why broadly a lot of hip hop research, whether it's about music or dance or what have you, or jazz research, didn't start in music departments or in dance departments, but in places like English, history, sociology, where there isn't a particular practitioner expertise that you're expected to have in order to be a voice in the conversation. Tomie, is there anything going on? Anything?
That's a really fascinating question, and it's actually really too bad that it's pitted from the opposite direction of the job. This is put so well, like from the job, and then what you need to do in order to fill a position, rather than from what your interest in your research is. I always think about it as a historical way of splitting up the senses. Of course, I always talk about the senses, but that comes from a very old European model, and where actually literally the body and the senses are split across campus. And if you look at maps of universities across the United States, not as much now as even 5 or 10 years ago, you'd have all the big ear people in one place, and all the people who move from here down, probably with PE, not to put them down or anything, and theater, and then people with really great eyes in another location far away from each other, and then people who theorize in all of these sensory organs are oftentimes even set away from those people. So I would hazard to say that it's actually really important, applause to Sam, but it's really important for us to collaborate, not only in research, but in creative endeavors, in order to really push beyond the limitations of, oh, this is your job, you have to do this, you know, these are the classes you must teach. And so I really would love to see more and more interaction between not only societies, but more inclusive research, because so many people are jumping between boundaries now. So thank you for that.
That I wanted to say that is kind of a core reason that I love being in dance studies spaces, is as I've been teaching in a school of music, I've been coming to appreciate how much body work all my colleagues do. It's kind of like the core of what most of the people in my building do, is one-on-one, you know, whether it's working on embouchure or breath or these very particular things with fingers, but music is a very, very body work intensive field, and musicologically, you know, maybe this stage is a little bit like, man, do people not want to talk about that? We have a deep discomfort with bodies, even as we are a very body work oriented field, and one thing that I love about being in dance spaces, and that I would love to see more of interaction, is all of the wonderful work and language that y'all have given us to have a long overdue conversation about bodies rather than just these ephemeral phenomena in the air.
Probably have time for one more quick question before we dance.
I just want to echo the thanks for such a wonderful panel, and to also acknowledge the work of kicking off this wonderful conference. So thanks to all of the panelists. I had a specific question for Tomie. I was very interested, well, first of all, thank you for such a beautiful and inspiring presentation. I really appreciated the attention to the embodied component and the gestural component. It was very gratifying, so thank you. My question is about this fascination with embodied anticipation as mirroring cultural sensibilities of time. And I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit more about that, specifically as you were thinking through embodying different time scales. And I'm curious about why anticipation is the thing that is compelling to you as compared to other
something that's a gut. One is that I'm working with neuroscientists and cognitive scientists, and they call themselves brain scientists, and they're really fascinated by notions of anticipation, and so they courted me into this area. And next month there's this huge conference in London called Anticipation. But as I look out at this particular audience, it's very, very clear to me, even though you're sitting quite still, but there's a presence and there's an embodiedness to every single person here that knows what time is on all of these levels. It's really juicy. We know how to land. We know time, but we're blinking our eyes. We don't think about, I'm gonna blink my eyes now. You'd be off. But thinking about time in larger structures is really fascinating, and I hadn't really considered that before. So the neuroscientists started to make me work at that. So I guess I took my own medicine in that I'm asking people to do something that's out of the ordinary for them. But the gut is that the T's and the carrot is that they started to prompt me with anticipation, and then I realized how deeply, if we think about ourselves as time-based artists or researchers, whatever you want to call yourself, then we're thinking about form and time. We're thinking about how we move within this structure of form and time on different levels. And for me, that's uber juicy. Because it's so ephemeral. And we're all so excited about it, but it is so ephemeral. And so there's that kind of capturing of presence that makes us weep and makes our hearts throb, right? And just looking at the footage of the Nureyev that wasn't, it's just like, I'm just sitting here. And speaking of time scales. So that's the gut. But it's related and threaded to the literal, which means that in a month I'm giving a paper at a workshop. So thank you for that question.
I want to thank all of the panelists, as well as the wonderful people at OSU, Harmony and Hannah and Karen Elliott, who allowed me to invite them here too. So thank you once again to our four panelists. Now you have to get up, because the dance party is about to begin after the chairs are all moved out of the way. But the bar is open, so that's your consolation.